Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you all are. Welcome to this Chatham House session on sanctions and how we can go forward with sanctions and the impact that they could have and are already having. We're joined today by Timothy Ash, who's Senior Sovereign Strategist Emerging Markets at Blue Bay Asset Management. Tim is going to talk a little bit about how effective the asset freeze is, about and what it actually really means to freeze assets and the impact that this can have on markets as well. Then we're going to have Dr. Katerina Bogoslavska, who's joining us from Basel, Switzerland. And she is a project manager at the Basel Anti-Money Laundering Index and at the Basel Institute on Governance. And Katerina will, I mixed up Tim and Katerina. Tim is going to talk about the scale and impact of the sanctions and the role of ESG. And Katerina is going to talk about what asset freezing actually means in reality. Then we are being joined from London by Valeria Gontareva, who is working at the LSE as a visiting senior fellow in the Institute of Global Affairs. Valeria will talk a little bit about what it means to have the Russian ruble replace payments for oil and gas, further sanctions and their impact in Russia. And then Vladimir Milov, who's a Russian economist, opposition politician, who's joining us from Vilnius, who will also talk about the effect of sanctions in Russia and how effective they could be and the road for the future. So having given this brief introductions, I will start with Tim to give us his view on the scale and impact of the sanctions and also what the effect will be on the markets and what this means for ESG. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Samantha. I mean, firstly, the scale of the response in terms of sanctions, in my mind, was pretty extraordinary. I mean, I think many people, in fact, the Russians themselves expected a very modest sanctions response, which maybe unfortunately impacted into their calculations in terms of the invasion, right? They didn't expect us to do very much. But I think if you look at the scale and breadth of what's been done, SWIFT was done. I mean, just remember the debate going into it. I mean, it just painful debate about whether or not SWIFT was going to be done. It was. Most banks have been sanctioned, many oligarchs, but also CBR. I mean, that was absolutely extraordinary to see the Central Bank of Russia sanctioned. I mean, I remember that week there was a research paper out of the US, I think on the Wednesday, that raised the issue. I was getting phoned on the Saturday with people for asking for info and trying to write research, little reports about it. And then it was done on the Sunday. And that was utterly extraordinary. And I think the Russians, never expected it. They'd pushed this agenda about Fortress Russia, 640 billion in FX reserves. I mean, I think that the CBR sanction was really a game changer. It put a significant portion of this 640 billion of FX reserves beyond reach. And I think it shocked the Russian establishment. I mean, Lavrov yesterday was going on about, they never expected the CBR to be sanctioned. And, I think what was notable, I think the fact that so much was done, and also the other interesting angle now is because the CBR was sanctioned, Russia has almost become a pariah state. I mean, a pariah state because what Putin is doing, the war crimes he's committing in Ukraine, etc. But it's not only the letter of the law, so it's not even the specifics of what you can and can't do. International business just does not want to transact with Russia. It's too risky. So even if you can do it, you don't want to. And I think the new thing for me, and it's this sort of ESG angle. I mean, ESG gets a lot of criticism, but actually the social media campaigns against Western business, Nestle, Renault, SocGen, JP Morgan, think of the index exclusion. You think of the equity and debt markets. The big banks, the index providers were kicking and screaming about this. They didn't want to exclude Russia, but there was a campaign online in social media embarrassing these big companies, and they were forced to roll over. I think that's really, really encouraging. And so the reason why the sanctions response, I think, has been pretty extraordinary and pretty devastating on Russia is because, Ukrainians embarrassed us all. I mean, the bravery of Zelensky, the bravery of the people made us all realize, actually, we're responsible for this. I mean, our appeasement, whether it's Londongrad or the German energy sector or German big business or whatever, we are responsible for what's going on in Ukraine. And if we're not able to step up militarily with a no-fly zone, etc., we need to do much more on the sanctions front. And I think that is actually happening. And I think that's pretty encouraging. In terms of impact, quite extraordinary in my mind. I mean, if you think of Russia, Russian equity and debt markets, I mean, they've kind of lost. I mean, equity markets down kind of 50%. It probably should be down further if the market wasn't closed. But if you think of debt markets and the ruble, I mean, debt markets, you think of the Russia 47, which was the benchmark long bond, was trading at 130 in October. 130, it's down at 20 cents now. It traded at 10 cents at one point before they actually serviced some debt. And this is important, I think, because a lot is made about the foreign portfolio investors stuck in trades on Russia and been long Russia, and it's their own stupidity, for not listening to their governments and being caught long Russia risk. But actually, the biggest holders of Russian assets, the biggest holders of Russian financial assets is Russians, right? Russians believed the lies of the Kremlin that they weren't going to invade, and they stayed investors. So, the extraordinary scenes of people queuing outside Russian banks, in the days after the invasion. I mean, the biggest losers here are Russians by far. Oligarchs, Russian middle class, who've seen their wealth, collapse. Probably a 75% loss of their wealth because of Putin's actions, and I think that will have an effect. I mean, the sort of middle classes and intellectuals and that, whatever in Moscow and St. Petersburg and cities that count will be really questioning Putin's actions and why they can't go on holiday now in Turkey and why they can't access. Well, they have a lot less wealth and they certainly can't access their money to buy all the Western consumer goods they're all used to. Things, I guess, there's still a lot more that can be done, and sure, other commentators on this call are going to talk about that. Some of the obvious ones for me is FATF, the Financial Action Task Force Against Terrorism. I mean, Russia is a terrorist state now. I mean, it's terrorizing the population of Ukraine. It's beyond me now why the FATF, they met a couple of weeks ago, they didn't take any action at all. I mean, Russia should be, the minimum should be on the FATF blacklist, and if not, it should be kicked out of FATF. All the Russian banks should be sanctioned. I mean, the smaller banks were not sanctioned. What I can make out, they've still been acting in the interests of the Russian state, trying to buy physical cash in Europe to get it back home, to kind of provide a physical cash buffer. That should be closed out. I know the UK government extended some of the sanctions today, but more needs to be done. I mean, interestingly, despite the fact that all Russian banks haven't been sanctioned, Western financial institutions don't want to deal with any Russian bank, whether or not they've been sanctioned or not. And again, it's this idea that Putin has created pariah status for Russia anyway. And what we're seeing is the actual impact of sanction is going beyond the actual letter of the law in terms of sanctions. Energy sector, I mean, obviously huge debate today. Lots of focus on the Germans and Hungarians that are kind of dragging their feet. I mean, look, there's obviously a really great paper by Sergei Guriev et al. This week that highlighted that there is a cost. Clearly there's a cost for Germany and Central Europe that have over-relied on energy, on Russian energy. But let's not forget about this, right? Germany is as responsible as Londongrad for facilitating Putin and the now terror that he's pursuing in Ukraine. It's Germany's own fault that they are now so reliant on German energy, and German business and German politicians have taken Putin's 40 pieces of silver for too long. They're now whinging about the cost that they need a transition period. Well, Ukraine doesn't have time. Right? I mean, the Germans may want to wait, and there may be a cost to the German economy, and it could be, anywhere from 0.5 to 3% of GDP in terms of the growth impact on Germany. That's the difference between a German buying a BMW Series 3 and a BMW Series 5. Let's not beat around the bush, right? Germany's survival is not under threat here. Ukraine's is. And the Germans have huge. I will finish, Samantha. Just give me a couple of seconds more. I know I'm ranting on. About this, but anyway, look, the Germans have huge fiscal space anyway to loosen policy if there is a growth effect, and I think that the time to act is now, not to wait. And just finally, interestingly, discussion about default. Lots of focus there on the debt service payments that on external debt that were finally made, and there was this game of chicken between the Ministry of Finance and OFAC. Right, the Russians basically, wanted to pretend they were going to default, to basically force bondholders to whinge to OFAC to say, please pay us, please liberalize the sanctions regime so we can get paid. Basically, OFAC held out, and the bondholders were paid, but from money that wasn't blocked by OFAC. So the good thing is money was taken. I'm going to, Samantha, just give me a couple of more minutes there.
We really have to wrap up now, Tim. I'm really sorry.
It is a really important point. Just give me, and I'll be quiet for the rest of the session.
We don't want you to be quiet for the rest.
The final point I've made is that the Russians themselves decided they didn't want to default, because a default is a massive hit for Russia. Once they default, it's 10 years out in financial isolation. Their bluff was called, but interestingly, OFAC now has huge leverage because the general license to allow external debt payments falls due on May 25th, right? So basically, we know the Russians hate the idea of default. The next step for OFAC is not to extend the general license, right? To force Russia into default and tell the Russians, they need to tell the Russians that unless they get out of Ukraine, the general license is not going to be extended, right? And Russia will be forced into default. I'll end there. Thank you.
So interesting. So we'll be repeating what happened in Tsarist Russia over 100 years ago. That was really interesting, Tim, particularly the German issue, that the Germans who actually increased their purchase of Russian gas after 2009, after Russia had already shown its capability to start using energy as a blackmail tool. So yes, now, Katerina, we would like to go over to you to talk about what asset freezing really means.
Yeah, thank you. I think we would all agree that news about asset freezing of Russian public officials and oligarchs made it to key headlines in the news, key headline makers. But what is behind that? So I wouldn't be so optimistic about the decision itself and the implications of it. We are talking now only about freeze of assets. It means that they cannot be used by Russian public officials or Russian oligarchs, but it doesn't mean that these assets are seized or they will be confiscated. It's completely different processes. So as for now, we are talking about only freeze order, political freeze order. We don't know how long this freeze order may last, but as for this term, these assets are not available for Russian oligarchs and Russian public officials. What happens next, we don't know. There is legal background what to do further. There should be either criminal investigation to prove that these assets are of criminal origin, and then these investigations have to be conducted on the territory where the assets were frozen. What issue do we have here? In order to prove criminal origin of the assets, and this will be sufficient to confiscate them based on the court order, there should be a substantial level of international mutual legal assistance between the state where the investigation is conducted and Russia, because the criminal offense itself, if they want to prove it, the criminal origin of money, the evidence have to come from Russia. We are not sure that this kind of cooperation is possible at all. The other way to go with these assets, to seize them and possibly further to confiscate, would be to link the assets to the financing of military campaign in Ukraine, person by person, looking at every person in the list and trying to find this connection. There we have to get support from Ukrainian authorities like NABU or General Prosecutor Office to keep these evidences and to provide that. But again, it's very difficult. What we have been facing now, that these assets are frozen, but there is an issue about even how to manage these assets. Who will pay for management of these assets? We all heard that yachts, expensive mansions are frozen. There should be some money to manage these assets, to pay for them. Otherwise, they are losing their market value, and there is no clear understanding who will do it and who will pay for that. So I would say that it's good that the assets were frozen. It's a good first step, but obviously it is not enough, and it is far, far away from the point where these assets can be confiscated or restored for any purposes. The other thing that I wanted to put my attention, to bring your attention, is on the scope of sanctions, trading sanctions from EU. Again, we've seen that this is a huge amount, and we are talking about huge efforts, but are these efforts enough as for now? My answer is not. Because if you look at the 4 packages of sanctions from EU, for example, ban on export of equipment technologies, especially for oil refinery plants, or restrictions on controlled dual-use items, or even ban on goods and technology for aviation. Most of these actions, they are prolonged up till May, June, or even September in some sectors. We do not see immediate reaction. They are prolonged for that contracts that have been already in place. So what we are talking about is that new contracts won't be issued, but with the old contracts, they might be prolonged up till September in some sections. What we also talking about, that as for now, EU, taking into account that it is one of the hugest trading partner with Russia, effectively they prohibit only 2.1% of EU imports from Russia. It is mainly on metallurgy and metallurgy sector. Can it be done more? Yes. Is it good that at least these steps are taken? Yes. So my conclusion is that we should look deeper in what is behind the news headlines and try to understand what are the issues that we have to have in our list to be prepared to give our answer. And one of them, as I've already mentioned, is management of frozen assets and attempts to seize them and confiscate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katerina. That was fascinating. Certainly some questions I had not even thought about, particularly the management of the assets. One issue that would be interesting maybe to address in the question answer is what happens if one day we decide to lift sanctions, and what that process would be as well, if we're thinking about the future and trying to be a little bit optimistic, which I agree is not very easy these days. Valeria, over to you, please, for your view on the issue.
First of all, my reflections for Tim and Katerina speeches. And what I'd like to say, I absolutely agree that it's a devastating sanctions. It's a really seismic negative effect on Russian economy, but of course it's not enough. And I think we need to use so-called top-down approach, because if we start right now to call for Russian default, sorry, it's absolutely nothing compared to real military crimes which already happened. And if everybody in this world call already Putin like a real criminal, war criminal, terrorist country, aggressor country, it means that we should not use absolutely general instruments and just a normal criminal or civil courts to resolve all these disputes. Should not be any disputes in this field anymore. It should be absolutely clear that we need some like a high tribunal or some special Nuremberg process for all of that. And absolutely agree with Katerina that frozen assets, real freeze, it's soaring nothing. It just be sitting and waiting when in 5 years' time, all these oligarchs win all court processes and we will return all this money back to these oligarchs. That's why we need again go back to top-down approach. It should be very high-level special Nuremberg process. This Nuremberg process should call all these criminals war criminals, and after, of course, this confiscation should be in a favor of reparation to Ukraine, and not only to Ukraine. I think it will be a lot of assets. It will be trillions, and that's why Russian central bank assets plus all assets of criminal oligarchs, all of that will cover the cost of Marshall Plan for Ukraine and suffering of all international businesses who withdraw all this money, all these businesses from Russia, because they also, it's very painful exercise for international companies right now, and they're doing that because right now it's very clear differentiation between value and values. Right now, everybody understands that it's very clear that priority number one is peaceful world. It's not anymore priority, not climate change, not a COVID. It's everybody understands that main threat right now, it's an absolutely crazy dictator sitting with red bottom of nuclear bombs. And that's why I think it should be a real priority. That's why sanctions, it's only partial right now. First of all, from the first day of this war, I immediately call all international organizations to exclude Russia like a country of aggressor, like a country of terror from all international organizations, means from United Union, from IMF, from all international financial institutions. Right now, you know, we even sent our letters to S&P and Fitch, to credit agencies, and ask them to stop providing and credit rating. But you know why S&P recently stopped to provide credit rating? Only because EU Commission orders them to do that. Means, you know, we could not wait anymore for, you know, voluntarily wishes of business to do something. Of course, we need some top-down approach. And of course, right now, the main sanctions which should be implemented, it's not so painful because it's already very soon it will be summertime. Means it's a really very good time, spring and summer, to implement embargo for oil and gas. I think we will, all, of course, people around the globe, and especially European Union and Germany, they will sacrifice a little bit in favor to stop the threat of nuclear war. And that's why, you know, right now, when we are paying Putin and his regime 700 million per day for oil and gas, 700 million per day. Could you imagine we're doing that? And it means that they could easily, and with such prices for oil and gas, for them, 50% of their budget, it's revenues from oil and gas. And you could imagine that last year their budget was balanced when oil price was 44. Right now, oil price is more than 100. Means even if we just not to cut, but cut only 50%, they will easily survive. But I think we need to do this sanction really draconian. Really draconic, very strong sanctions. And right now I'd like to comment about Russian ruble settlement for oil and gas, because yesterday, you know, that Russian ruble even appreciated after this announcement. And I was really surprised to see this appreciation, frankly speaking. Maybe, you know, I'm a former governor of the central bank. And of course, I understand some macroeconomic consequences of all these sanctions. Of course, right now, maybe it's very difficult to say what the real GDP percentage of GDP loss we will observe in Russia. In Ukraine, unfortunately, it's more easy to say right now because we see the real physical, how physically destroy the infrastructure and industry in Ukraine, and what the business disruption happened in Ukraine. In Russia, it's more difficult right now to say precise numbers. Even Nabiulina refused to announce yesterday in or her press conference these figures. But be back to settlement. You know, when I heard this announcement, Putin announcement yesterday about Russian ruble settlement, I asked myself about very simple rule of mathematics. You know, law of addition. Law of addition, it's very simple. It doesn't matter what order you end up numbers, you will always get the same result. Means that it doesn't matter if you pay Putin 700 million per day in dollars in euro, or you start to pay dollars in euro, convert to Russian ruble, and after to pay for oil and gas. It means it absolutely doesn't matter. But why I think that it's even good idea? Because, you know, when we ask to switch off Russia from SWIFT, European Union hesitated to do that. They only switch off 7 banks, and they never introduce full, complete stop of SWIFT payments. And even Gazprom Bank was not excluded from SWIFT. And you know why? Because they'd like to settle everything in euro and US dollars. Right now, when it will be already announced that it will be in Russian ruble, of course, it's a very good idea to switch off completely Russian banks from all Russian banks from SWIFT system. And it will also help to all international subsidiaries of foreign banks to take a right decision and close these Russian subsidiaries, because, you know, Raiffeisen Bank, some other foreign banks still not even announced their idea to close their Russian subsidiaries. That's why I think that Russian ruble settlement, first of all, it doesn't matter for Russian economy, because we need to stop to buy oil and gas, whatever in Russian ruble, in euro or in US dollars. It's the first idea. And the second idea, we need, if it's happened, we need to switch off all SWIFT payments. It's no longer needed for Russian, for this export. Import. And what else? Of course, it will help to close Russian foreign subsidiaries or in Russian territory. And I think that it's even a good idea. It's my reflection about Russian settlement and Russian rubles.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Again, very enlightening. The core question of Russian rubles. I mean, I've just been thinking how would we pay in Russian rubles, because the ruble isn't a convertible currency as far as I understand.
Yeah, so but it's very easy. You open account in foreign with Russian bank in Russian ruble, you send your US dollars, they convert at fixed rate through Moscow exchange. It's very easy settlement. You will not even but we need to introduce embargo for oil and gas. It's only one way how to stop it, not Russian ruble or US dollar.
Well, I think there will be a lot of discussion on that in the Q&A. Just to remind everybody, the Q&As have to be sent in written form in the little Q&A box. So those who haven't done so yet, please do. I've got 2 very interesting questions that have already come in. And also this is on the record. So if there are questions that you would not want to have asked on the record, bear that in mind. Now we are going to go to Vladimir Milov, who is an opposition politician in Russia, who has I've listened to a number of your talks. You have some very strong, interesting and uncompromising views about what needs to be done. So over to you, and maybe you would like to comment on what has already been said and add your perspective as to how effective these sanctions could actually be in changing things in the Russian leadership. Thank you, Vladimir.
Thank you so much. I'll pick up on the last point about Putin's idea that payments for Russian gas should come in rubles. I think that is virtually impossible. Because I regulated Gazprom when I worked in government, so I know what is written in their long-term export contracts. they explicitly stipulate that payment for Russian gas supplies should be made in specific currency, US dollars or euros. So to change that, you have to change the contract, and it takes both parties to agree. And Gazprom's buyers in Europe would never agree to that because they are being exposed to enormous currency risk if they only agree to pay for the gas in rubles. And which means that this case, if Gazprom really would want to reconsider the contracts, they will have to take the case to Stockholm arbitration, where they are most likely to lose because there are no good reasons for actually switching to payments in rubles, except some political craziness out there somewhere in Moscow, Novoogaryov, or elsewhere, right? So I think this is just a threat. I think also there is a lot of speculative element in what Putin had to say, because it immediately impacted positively ruble exchange rate at the Russian exchange. So I think maybe he didn't really mean it, but just wanted to achieve this short-term insider trading speculative effect. But I think in reality, it's really not going to happen. Now, generally, I would like to pick up on Tim's comments, and actually very good comments. Thanks for allowing him to speak a little bit over time. That's very important. I really believe that the central bank sanctions are a game changer, because the Russian calculation was that first, the Western sanctions response will be relatively mild and sort of bearable for the Russian economy. And then they really counted big on central banks' reserves to weather through all these difficult times. This is why they have been beefing them up right beforehand, before the invasion of Ukraine. So that was a very surprising and devastating blow, that they cannot actually use these reserves. And you got to understand that it's just not like half of Russian reserves have been blocked, but great majority of usable currency reserves were blocked, because largely what remains under Russian control are reserves nominated in Chinese currency and gold, monetary gold, which has been also increasing lately as share of the reserve. Now that both gold and Chinese renminbi, they are not useful at all to calm down the currency markets. And currency markets are extremely important, because also this crisis had exposed once again how much Russia is totally dependent on imports of everything. Imports of everything, components, goods, services, logistics, technologies, whatever. Which means that whenever there is a strong devaluation of the ruble, Russian real incomes significantly fall, because that has a very short lag time before being reflected on consumer prices, because the import dependence is still high. Most of what we do manufacture in Russia actually is heavily dependent on either raw materials or component parts which are imported. For instance, in medicines, in the pharmaceutical industry, like 80% of pharma produced is dependent on imports of raw materials. And there are many other sectors which are also heavily dependent as well. Which means that we're already seeing that the growth in prices for basic consumer goods, basic services is already double-digit in most of the Russian regions. That is a reflection of another jump of the dollar and euro exchange rate. And obviously, I think this is one of the effects that is currently underlooked and underestimated by the West, that Russia had effectively liquidated the free currency market. It had prohibited the population to buy currency. So we effectively back to the very black market Soviet times. And that is important because it makes no sense to discuss the official exchange rate anymore. Because I got a lot of feedback from ordinary Russians from most regions, all regions of the country. And the reports are that the actual ability to buy currency are being confronted with totally different exchange rates than what you hear in the news. Like, oh, ruble has somehow appreciated on the news that Putin ordered to pay for gas in rubles, right? Yeah, at the exchange maybe. But people who really want to buy dollars, they face a totally different rate. So that's important for analysis to understand that we're back into black market times. And one more thing I wanted to say is that, the nature of these sanctions is that Russia has been now caught in between a rock and a hard place. Because on one hand, there are all these sanctions coming from the governments, asset freezes, increase of import tariffs for Russian goods, and inclusion of companies and persons onto sanctions lists so nobody can deal with them and so on. But on the other hand, from bottom up, you have a massive exit of hundreds of companies, either from Russia or from working with Russian contractors like the international logistics companies, Maersk and other container companies and so on. Now that is extremely important because on top of the government sanctions, you really have a lot of disruptions, systemic disruptions of supply chain, technology chain, whatever. So listen, I think it's fair to say that we have never, ever experienced in the history of mankind such a major cutoff of a major economy from globalization. Because Iranian and North Korean examples are not really relevant. They were not too integrated, and like Iran was not completely cut off to such an extent. So I think what is happening is really unprecedented. In a few weeks and months down the road, it will have an absolutely devastating impact, not only on the economy, but generally on life in Russia. The empty shelves in grocery stores are back. The double-digit inflation is back. It might be even replaced with a three-digit inflation somewhere down the road if things go that way. That will have a profound impact on structural integrity of Putin's political system. It's another topic of the mechanisms how the political situation will evolve. However, I have to say that Putin has never confronted any sort of, even remotely reminiscent magnitude of difficulties like this. And he was already in a pretty weak position before the war. His public approval was down and the country was lacking vision of whither forward. But right now, I think you saw the departure of Chubais from Russia. I think this is just a very early sign. I know a lot of my former colleagues, bureaucrats, who are now simply questioning Kremlin's ability to govern, to essentially govern the country. This is not, Russian system is still very much centralized. There's a great extent of grip and control over society by Putin. But this is some sort of tsunami is coming, which will be very, very hard for him personally to withstand. And he has wielded so much personal power that no question about that. The responsibility will be brought upon him. Very soon, people will stop talking about the Nazis in Kiev. They will begin talking about empty shelves in the grocery store. I remember how that happened in the 80s. I lived through that myself. So in that moment of time, people will be simply questioning who is at the helm, who is responsible, who made us come to this point, which we actually never expected, and the television promised us that we great again, we're back from our knees, we're great superpower, but with empty shelves now, seriously. So I think this will have a political impact. It's really another topic to discuss. How these changes might evolve. I might shortly elaborate on that further, but really the impact of sanctions so far is devastating, and I think Kremlin was caught by surprise by the Western unity, resolve in doing that, and actually have a wide array of options that they had and what they actually did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Fascinating insights into what's going on in Russia here. We've now come to the question and answer session. So if I can remind all attendees, this is on the record and we have muted everyone's microphone. So please type in your questions. There were a number of questions that are coming in, which I'm going to try and group about how sanctions can be evaded. One question from Dina Mufti: can sanctions extend to assets held in trusts? And another question coming from Alexander Karapiperis, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, that is directed to Tim, but maybe others would also be able to answer, is how Russia could maybe be using Turkey and its financial sector to circumvent sanctions. So maybe we'll start with Tim and then open up the floor to everyone else to really look at how how sanctions can be evaded. I've heard that the Chinese may be actually holding formerly Russian-held American Treasury bonds in their place. So there's a lot of questions here about how sanctions are being evaded. And let's start with maybe addressing the one of trusts, if anyone has an answer to that, Tim or Katerina. Katerina?
If I may start, about trusts, it's a general question about transparency of legal persons and legal arrangements. So if we have an information about beneficial owners in trust, which is very difficult to get, then we can ensure that sanctions will go to the beneficial owners of trust. But if the trust use complex corporate structures like several companies and you don't have beneficial owners behind them, obviously it is a way to circumvent the sanctions. However, I would say even if we find all the assets just that belong to the sanctioned people, that would be also a great job to have. But as I said, there are always ways how to circumvent sanctions, and we should be also open and clear about that.
And Tim, so to me to get to this question on Turkey, so to what extent is Russia using Turkey and particularly its financial sector? Turkey's extending its foreign exchange deposit scheme to foreigners, and it could become a hub for Russian money. So how will this help Russia evade sanctions?
Yeah, well, it's certainly definitely a big focus for Western governments. We've had, Rutte, the Dutch PM, was meeting Erdogan. I mean, Turkey's in a difficult position, right? It's on the cusp of a balance of payments crisis continually for the last 4 or 5 years because of mismanagement of monetary policy by Erdogan. Large current account deficit, shortage of portfolio inflows, and now probably one of the most vulnerable in terms of fallout from the Ukraine war because of they're a big energy importer. They also import a lot of food from both Russia and Ukraine, and tourism is really important. So the Erdogan administration probably, the current account was probably going to be, I don't know, $10 billion this year. It could be $50 to $60 billion. They're desperate for money. So if the Russians turn up and they offer to provide cover that financing gap, I think the Turks would be kind of quite amenable. So there's a lot of pressure from the West remember, Turkey hasn't joined the sanctions and Turkish airspace remains open, and Turks, Chubais was seemingly in Turkey trying to get his money out of a cash dispenser this week. Look, the Turks are, trying to, in a difficult position, and I think we need to recognize that this could push the Turkish economy over the edge and cause a balance of payments problem. So I think Western governments should be supportive of the Turks. So we should try and provide financing as an alternative to Russian, whatever, capital flight or dirty money, whatever you want to call it. The difficulty is with this is that, for example, things like swaps to the central bank, right? I mean, that's a good option. But Turkey's running terrible monetary policy, right? So, I mean, if basically the Fed and ECB provides all these swaps to as an alternative to Russian money, I mean, in a way, you're helping them continue bad policy. Their monetary policy is awful. So it's a bit of a difficult situation. So we need to negotiate with the Turks to say, we'll provide you financing, but you need to, you go back to some kind of orthodoxy in terms of monetary policy. One thing I would add, that talking to Turkish bankers, there's experience here. Halkbank with Iran, you probably remember Iran's sanctions busting, and obviously there's a court case in the US. But the Turkish banking sector and Turkish private banks are really well run, and they're massively nervous about getting caught in secondary sanctions. So even if the Erdogan administration is kind of quite amenable to Russian capital flows, maybe the banking sector itself will self-sanction themselves, or they will be very reluctant to take Russian money because they don't want to be caught in any OFAC response, secondary sanctions responses. So Turkey is an interesting and difficult one, but we need to be kind of supportive of the Turks to help them get through this, I think.
Great, thanks a lot, Tim. Does anybody else want to come in on this question? Otherwise, I've got a lot of questions here on oil and gas and their alternatives. Valeria.
Yes, I could. It's a very interesting question about Turkish banking system, but how we will, we are talking about what kind of money of private individuals, but private individuals' money Right now, Russian central bank introduced absolutely draconian administrative measures for any capital flows. Means that this threat that private individuals' money of Russians will somehow appear in a banking system of Turkey, I think it's quite exaggerated. Now, as we are talking about money of oligarchs, I truly believe that Turkey right now follow all the rule, all these blacklists. If all these people will be in a blacklist, in a sanction list, they will never open any accounts to these people. That's why I would not really worried about Turkish banking system overcrowded by Russian money. I'm more worried about Russian banking system because it could be real collapse here.
Mm-hmm. Maybe if you've got some time at the end, it'd be interesting to see about what's happening in Dubai as a potential haven for Russian money. So. But to move forward here, we've got a lot of questions on oil and gas. So, how can Europe shift away from Russia? We have Germany, which imports, I think, 70 or 80% of its gas from Russia. The European Union has recently, was expected to announce today, a common purchasing policy for gas, which could somehow mitigate the pain. The UK is obviously a little bit more in a better situation, but how can realistically Europe shift away from Russia? Very interesting question here on pipelines from Andrew Alkin. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. So with pipelines that are going through Ukraine, if there is no oil and gas embargo on Russia, could Ukraine be tempted to sabotage pipelines? Interesting point of view. Never thought about that myself. What we do know is the oil pipeline from the Caspian pipeline consortium is being repaired for bad weather, and the Russians are sort of taking a long time to repair it. Is this a way of lessening the deliveries of oil to Europe? Without actually saying so. Again, another anonymous question. The European gas price really have a choice if Gazprom only accepts rubles anymore? Perhaps this could be a way of putting pressure on Europe and saying, take it or leave it. So yes, maybe I think all of you probably have things to say on these questions. So let's start with Katerina and then just move down the panel. So comments on alternatives in oil and gas and what Russia might be prepared to do next on the oil and gas front.
I think that one of the alternative, for sure, it will not be possible to substitute all amount of gas from Russia, but one of the alternative will be cooperation with Qatar. We know that there was a high-level visit and we don't know whether the sides agreed on something or not, but I think that Middle East, Qatar and other countries there might be a way to look forward, like a way to find alternatives. There were also some discussions which I saw in media on the role of Venezuela, but this is a huge question whether whether it is feasible or not. But as for now, Qatar is already in the list for discussion and for some talks around.
Thank you. Vladimir, I know you've spoken quite a lot in the past about oil and gas. Would you like to come in on this?
Yes, definitely. First, again, I would come back to the issue of payments for Russian gas in rubles. That is not possible. That is not possible because contracts stipulate very precisely payment in dollars or in euros and a specific bank account. So essentially, what European buyers can do, they will simply send the same hard currency to Gazprom's accounts, fulfilling the contracts, and that will be it. If Gazprom doesn't want to receive this money and will block these accounts, I mean, come on, that's one option. There is no way Gazprom legally can make European consumers pay for Russian gas in rubles. Contracts stipulate very clearly, and Gazprom is to lose any arbitration on the matter. That's pretty clear. Now, oil and gas embargo. That's a complicated topic. A few points. It's point number one. It is already underway to a significant extent. US, Canada, UK have announced their measures. Moreover, again, as I said, that's a rock in a hard place situation. There is also a lot of bottom-up movement from traders, refiners who refuse to buy Russian oil. Just Google spread between Brent and Urals oil price, and you will see that Russians are forced to sell the oil right now with huge discounts. You get news daily that many Russian companies are actually not able to physically sell their oil. There is zero showing up by the traders at the auctions and so on. So Russians are already losing a lot of money. I think the estimate of International Energy Agency was that by beginning of April, they will already lose about 3 million barrels a day of their oil and refined products exports. That's a lot. Now, can we move ahead with further measures, and can European Union introduce oil and gas embargo? I think my suggestion is very simple. Try work with member states first. For example, Poland has an extremely high public support for measures to defend Ukraine, which might bear certain costs. So basically, unlike Italians or French, the residents of Poland are more ready to suffer consequences to defend Ukraine. Now, Poland buys over 500,000 barrels a day through Druzhba. They can impose oil embargo themselves. They really do have, and Poland have been actively working with Saudi Arabia and other producers of heavy sour crudes, which are resemblant of the Russian Urals. I think there's nothing interferes with Poland declaring this embargo tomorrow. I think they can do it. I hope they will do it. Now, in terms of European unity, my understanding is they are moving. The EU will move towards at least introduction of some gradual embargo measures, maybe against refined products, maybe LNG, whatever. So there will be a movement in that direction. I think the most important part is that any day of continuing Putin's aggressions should be met with more sanctions. That's the principle. And obviously, oil and gas is high on the agenda. So I believe that we will see more measures on that front in the coming days and weeks. And also, I have to say that, yeah, there is the short-term pain. Like, I'm living in Lithuania for about a year now, and everybody is complaining about the gas bills, which have skyrocketed this winter. That is a huge political issue. In a democracy, you got to pay some respect for that. However, I have to say that strategic benefits of disconnecting Russian oil and gas from global markets would be enormous. It will accelerate green transition, not wait and delay, but really accelerate practical measures in this regard. And this will largely remove a strategic threat that is posed to Europe and the rest of the world by Russian oil and gas dependence, maybe getting rid of it once and for all. So I think Europeans should go for it, and many of them understand that it's necessary.
Thanks, Vladimir. I'd really like a quick reaction from Timothy and Valeria, but if you can both add in your reactions. A lot of people are asking about potash. Do you expect there to be any sanctions on potash imports, which of course are vital for Europe and the UK's agricultural sector, for our livestock? So this is potentially as devastating, if not more so, than cutting ourselves off Russian oil and gas, because of the vast quantity that we import both from Russia and Ukraine. So Tim, Valeria, really quick answers, because I've got some fantastic questions that are still really need to be addressed here. Ladies first. Valeria, very quickly.
First of all, about this embargo for oil and gas. And you know that oil, of course, it's more easy to do. Gas, it's a transportation through pipelines. That's why it's not so easy to do. But again, we again should be talking from top-down approach, value against values. If Germany will sacrifice 1 or 2% of their GDP for peaceful, non-nuclear world, I think it's time to do that right now. Otherwise, they will do that because Putin, you know, we're talking that sometimes that it's Ukrainian local conflict. Everybody knows that it's not a local conflict. It's a real full-fledged bloody war with missiles, with bombs, with troops and tanks. And some people like to say that it's not a third world war. Unfortunately, it's a third world war. The good idea that it's a war of whole civilized humanity against one absolutely crazy aggressor. It means that if we concentrate all our efforts together and understand that Putin consider all sanctions like atomic weapon, Putin consider all weapons from NATO, which NATO provided to Ukraine, like participation of NATO in this war. That's why we need to stop hypocrisy. And if we stop hypocrisy and say that our main goal of sustainable development of our world is to stop this war, because tomorrow it will be nuclear war. And we could easily introduce for example, a heating season already not there, means that we need only gas for industry. We could find industries which extremely need this gas. And for others, we could easily cut, but it should be top-down approach. Yeah. We sacrifice 2% of our GDP in this favor. It should be, and about, of course, agriculture. It's right now, you know, that Russian in Ukraine, it's 25% of wheat and corn production in the world. If, for example,
and potash is
of course,
really important.
And if of course, for example, this oil you could produce someone else, it will be only question of price. With agriculture, of course, it's not. It's if you not produce, it will be starvation in Africa, in other countries. And I think it's a very, very important to understand that. I could not tell you right now about agri-season in Ukraine. Sorry, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. In Russia, it's, of course, it's 15%. I couldn't comment with exact figures.
Look, I mean, just fantastic, Valeria. I mean, summed it up perfectly. I mean, I think we all agree with that. I mean, Germany has to make a decision. 3% loss of GDP growth, or it's going to be spending 1% of GDP more in defense for the next 20 years, right? This is an existential threat to us and our system, right? This is a globally systemic event. You know, it's like COVID, right? If we're serious about our defense, then, you know, we have to step up and stop Putin now. Otherwise, you know, we're going to be living in fear for a long time to come. One positive thing I'd say in all this is our populations get it, right? Look at the change of opinion in the US, pretty remarkable. They know why gas prices are rising, right? The gas prices are rising not because of sanctions. Gas prices are rising because Putin has invaded Ukraine. They get it, right? Our populations seem willing to go the extra mile to help the Ukrainians, right? Our politicians, particularly the German politicians, need to understand that. So I think there is a willingness to pay the price here. Governments, you know, obviously need to step up and help poorer populations who will disproportionately bear the impact of that. And Germany, again, has huge fiscal space to help its poorer populations. On food prices, you know, again, clearly a global problem, and you know, this crisis is globally systemic. It's not just about oil and energy; it's about all the commodities that Russia exports. You know, again, poorer countries in the world, they need to be knocking on Moscow's door. They need to be telling Moscow, you know, stop what you're doing in Ukraine because it's making us poorer. It's making, you know, it's driving up food prices. You know, I mean, like Valeria said, I mean, you know, one of the reasons why grain prices is higher is okay, fertilizer prices are going higher, but in the short term, Ukraine is not able to export out of its storage, right? Its ports are closed. Why are its ports closed? Not because of sanctions, its ports are closed because Russia is invading the country, right? So, you know, the West needs to step up and provide, you know, more development assistance to poor countries impacted by higher food and energy prices. But those countries, you know, need to be, you know, ringing Moscow and telling them to get out of Ukraine because, you know, you are causing a globally systemic problem, probably equivalent to COVID, right? Anyway, sorry, on China, I forgot that bit of the question. On China, the encouraging thing, you know, I was of the view that possibly China would view Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an opportunity to go into Taiwan. I think what's interesting about the Chinese response is they're quite happy because in a way, the Chinese were in the doghouse with the Americans, right? They were the enemy number one in Washington. And now suddenly Putin is, right? So there's now a window for rapprochement between China and the US. And I think encouragingly, the Chinese companies and banks are really reluctant to get caught in secondary sanctions, right? So, and I think the Chinese are looking at Putin thinking, this guy's rash. I mean, just big picture generally, the Chinese like the status quo. They like globalization. They were winners from status quo. Putin is attacking the status quo and they hate it, right? So I don't know. I tend to think that ultimately the Chinese are not going to really be bailing Putin out, right? That he's kind of he's burnt his bridges with the West, and the bridge is kind of half burnt with the Chinese.
Thanks, Tim. I agree with you on the Chinese, although they do seem to be trying to play on both fronts here. But ultimately, I think they know their interests do lie with keeping the West on their side. A question a lot of people are asking about what's happening inside the Kremlin, and I think that although we are all to hear about sanctions, one of the points of sanctions is to put enough pressure on Putin for him to change his course. So perhaps, Vladimir, you might like to come in on this one. The fact that Shoigu and Gerasimov have not been seen for, I think, since 11th of March, that there have been some senior people who seem to have retired or stepped down or disappeared from the FSB. Do you think that the idea of a palace coup is actually plausible? And could the assets speed this up? Sorry, could the sanctions speed this up?
I will come to that in a minute, but I'm tempted also to pick up on the China issue. Here's where I do not necessarily agree with Tim that Chinese are happy. I think it's more complicated because, they are probably happy that they are a bit sidelined as the evil number one in the world by Putin now. And then they might have some reapproachment with the United States. But I'd say first, they are generally torn apart. Because on one hand, they have been investing a lot in building a strategic alliance with Putin. And now, as we can see clearly, Putin is demanding some support from China. So that is, I'm not sure China wants to get dragged into a conflict, probably exactly the opposite. But that is a very uneasy situation when they do have requests and expectations for help from Putin, whom they've been considering an ally in the standoff with the West. But they can't respond. That's a very uncomfortable position. So I think, generally, I believe Chinese will not be bailing out Putin, pretty much the same as they haven't done in the past 8 years. By the way, I wrote a paper specifically on that, why Russian-Chinese economic cooperation is not working the way Putin expected in 2014 for the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies in Brussels. We'll be happy to send you a link. Please take a look. But they will have to respond somehow. That threatens the very alliance between Russia and China, which is strategically very important for China. Another issue is that, as many military analysts point out, military takeover of Taiwan, which China has been threatening with for a long time, is now virtually impossible. After all, what happened? Because Chinese have witnessed themselves how difficult it is to launch an operation like that and face a coordinated Western response. So I think we can safely now assume that military takeover of Taiwan is now off the table after what happened in Ukraine. That's bad news for Beijing. Now, on coup d'etat in Russia, many people are talking about that. I think they are exaggerating the real news that Russian elite is very unhappy with what Putin is doing. It is unhappy, but it is also extremely incapable. And it is by design. Putin has been building this system for nearly a quarter of a century now. He doesn't have any legitimate collective governance body like Soviet Politburo, which could have disposed general secretary if it wanted to. There is no collective body. There's only one center of legitimacy, the president. People speak about Shoigu, but Putin is guarded by Federal Security Service, FSO. with enormous top secret budget and 50,000 servicemen. Importantly, again, if we compare this to Soviet examples of coup d'etat, Putin had included special communications spetsvaz into the FSO. So it's not possible. If Shoigu says, I'm president now, he can't cut off Putin from communications because this is part of the president's guard, right? And president's guard is extremely well paid and was specifically designed to protect Putin from a potential coup d'etat. So there's no legitimacy for anyone if he declares himself a ruler tomorrow. Nobody would fulfill his orders because there is no Politburo. Savbez and Gossovет, they have no constitutional status, right? It's extremely difficult also because it's very challenging. All of them are being monitored 24/7 by the FSB. Now, my friends in the state service tell me that they cannot even, have a one-on-one meeting in a cafe discussing what a bad guy Putin is, because it would most likely be recorded and reported. Like 3, 4, 5-person meetings discussing the same issue are completely off the table because FSB will be on them and will report it to Putin immediately. So yeah, elite is unhappy, but there's a big gap between that and some practical steps to get rid of Putin. So what we should be focusing instead is not hoping for a coup in Russia, but exerting pressure on all fronts, sanctions, domestic public opinion, Ukrainian resistance in the first place, so that the further structural blows to integrity of the system are delivered and it begins to disintegrate rather sooner than later. So I think internal chances for coup d'etat are not too high.
Very, very interesting. And I guess it really shows how important the discussion on sanctions is. I'm getting a lot of questions here on Western companies that are still operating in Russia. And there was a big scandal about Renault resuming its operations. But it actually yesterday announced that it was gonna stop its operations. But I'd be really interested, Mimi, to hear from Katerina here on what the legality would be of imposing sanctions on those Western companies that are still operating in Russia. And because there are a lot of questions, and I'm trying to group all these. But let's look at these Western companies who have still, in spite of the ESG issues and the risk, the reputational risk, they are still operating in Russia.
I think here question is not in the legal side of their activities, but more on the moral side. And I guess that the most valuable instrument there is public opinion. One of the company still operating in Russia in Nestle, and I know that here in Switzerland there are protests against that. So they partially removing part of their businesses from Russia. So I guess that it is not even about legal consequences. It's more about moral consequences and public pressure.
Thank you for that. Valerie, would you like to comment on that?
First of all, I call all the time, we need, first of all, stop hypocrisy. Because sometimes when we announced some sanctions, and after, as Katerina said, we try to dig deeper and recognize that it's just like a sanction for 0.1% of trade. That's why we need a real good task force to show all this hypocrisy, to show that we need a real sanctions, not just, for example, international company just postpones their business for 1 week, for 1 month, for 3 months. They're still paying salaries. You'd like for us to see the impact for GDP, but if they still paying salaries to their employees. In the same time, we see how Russian army even arise from the surface of earth, Ukrainian cities, they kill Ukrainian people. And that's why, we need to stop hypocrisy and really created the database about the companies and their real sanctions against Russia, not just some slogans in media. And what I'd like to tell more, it's about, right now I recall the song, Beatles song, we all live in a yellow submarine. But I'd like to tell you that Putin's submarine, it's not yellow, they gray, and they stay 100 kilometers from London in English Channel with nuclear warheads, missiles. Be prepared, top-down approach, wake up.
Thank you very much for that, Valeria. On the issue of submarines, France now has 3 of its nuclear submarines which have left port and are somewhere in the depths of the ocean somewhere. This has hardly ever happened. It's never happened in the last, I think, 25 years. Normally they only have 1 on alert all the time. And I'll remind you all that France is the only European country with this independent nuclear capability. Anyway, let's move on from that. I'd like to pick up something that you said, Valeria, and this will lead me into a question from Elvira Scamara, and maybe all panelists could comment on this because it's a really good point. Valeria, you said that this is the fight of the civilized world against one crazy man. If we look at what's happening, though, apart from the European Union, the UK, and North America, the rest of the world is either unaligned or more or less, potentially siding with Russia. So this is the question from Elvira. Given that Russia is not completely isolated after Western sanctions, because China, India, Saudi Arabia, and other countries taking up the space, would it mean simply transition to a multipolar world? I feel that a multipolar world would be a good case scenario, and a bipolar world with the West pretty isolated is another scenario. So perhaps, Tim, I haven't spoken to you for a while. Why don't we start with you and then go through each panelist just very, very quickly. What is this potential multipolar or bipolar world that's in which we are a minority?
Yeah, it kind of worries me. I mean, in Twitter sphere, I'm quite I do quite a lot, and the number of, unfortunately, emerging market countries and people in emerging markets, Turkey, India, it frustrates me that they blame all this on the Americans, right? Actually, I was at a conference in Antalya, the Antalya kind of peace talks. I went over there, and one of the Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, was interviewed by I forget the person's name, but basically a lady with an Arab surname and an Irish accent, and she incredibly he insulted him. She said basically, in the end, isn't the crisis in Ukraine mostly because of NATO? In fact, significantly because of NATO. What an extraordinary comment, right? The crisis in Ukraine is because of Putin, and because Putin, has got this greater vision and whatever you want to call it, genocide against Ukraine, right? That's the reality. So it frustrates me that, many people in emerging markets seem to have this underlying hatred of America and Britain and our way of governance, and they don't understand that essentially this is about colonialization. It's about Russia's imperial ambitions, or Putin's imperial ambitions against Ukraine. So I find that frustrating. And you asked me about Turkey before. And again, in the end, I don't really get why Turkey, a NATO member, isn't doing more. It's supplying Bayraktar drones, which are incredibly successful, but it's not imposing sanctions. It's not coming in line with the West in terms of sanctions. It should have an interest. It's a literal neighbor of Russia in the Black Sea. If Russia is successful and takes over Ukraine, Turkey is not going to be. It's going to be a lot less safe. And I think that's something we all have to think about in Europe. What happens if Putin is successful here, right? A new Iron Curtain, he's drawn across Europe. We're back to where we were pre-91, actually pre-83 probably, and we're going to have to pay it. We'll pay a huge price for that. So sorry, Samantha, I probably didn't answer that question at all, but anyway, there you go.
It's great. Vladimir, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I think the good news here is that we see that democratic world has a lot more weight over global markets, financial systems, technology than all the rest. That the emerging markets, which take an ambiguous position, I agree here with Tim. So what position the democratic world takes matters more, fortunately, at this point. And I think let's not just look on the grim side. There's a bright side, because we've seen incredible unity on part of the democratic powers. Also, I have to say, sanctions have been joined. Yeah, I absolutely agree about very weak positions of Turkey and also Israel, who are really afraid of stepping in and joining the sanctions. But on the other hand, we see very powerful examples of Taiwan and South Korea, which announced that they will be, in fact, joining sanctions. So it's not about just a transatlantic thing, but a global democratic response to what is happening. And on the emerging markets, I think strategically, these countries which take ambiguous position at the moment, and yeah, really there are this very big sentiment of viewing the West as colonial and viewing NATO as bad, and all that psychological remnants of the Cold War. But I think they will have to understand that they have to undergo also very significant rethinking of the global world order and their place in it. If they don't do that, they will probably remain emerging markets forever. They will not truly integrate into developed world if also they will not rethink their somewhat tribalist, somewhat post-colonial attitudes, which are really not relevant for the 21st century. So it's, yeah, on one hand, it's sad to watch that they sort of distance themselves from democratic global response to Putin's aggression. But it's also, I mean, it's their choice. They will have to live with it. And the free world will also be skeptical towards these countries and their future role in the world if they continue to behave like that. So it's not just we have to beg them to join sanctions. It's also their choice, which will deliver downsides for them. They might never grow up if they behave in this 19th century tribalist way. So there are two sides to this story, I have to say.
I'd like also...
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, please, Valeria.
Yes, you know that in United Nations Assembly, 141 countries supported Ukraine. Only 5 countries supported Russia. That's why it's not, about that, about everybody. It's against the war. But some countries, of course, were neutral. And of course, we are worried about some so-called neutral countries. But in the same time, we need to understand that we should not always show like democracy against authoritarian country. Right now, it's for everybody should be clear. It's not a democracy. It's a world against crazy war criminals. Means that if we need to stop Russia, and not Russia, but Putin's regime. You know, we're talking about Putin's regime. If, for example, our colleague right now told that coup is just absolutely impossible in Russia, because one very, very clever Putin completely set up something in this country which could not be destroyed anyhow. But it was a very good telephone conversation between China and Biden recently, when Russia was just excluded like a 3-pole. Means, unfortunately, world will be 2 poles. You know, we should stop to call it democracy, autocracy. It should be 2, because for example, China, it's quite a peaceful nation, as you could observe right now. Let's hope that it will be next 1,000 years as well. And but these poles, of course, we need to find some common ground for these 2 poles. And first of all, it's a new world order. It's a new international financial organization, because as you remember, China still has just 5% maybe voting rights in IMF, when it should be like America. And that's why I think it should be also, from American side, it should be also some understanding of equal rights for all countries, not just democracy against autocracy.
It would also be interesting to discuss whether anything can be done about Dubai, and whether there are any ways in which, if Dubai becomes a hub for Russian money, whether there's anything that can be done to blacklist Dubai.
Sure.
I don't know if anybody can hear me here, because...
Yeah, we heard you. Yeah. On the On the bipolar world, I don't think that it's feasible to see bipolar world. I think we moved far away from it, and we have a multipolar system of world politics, and the center of gravity sometimes moving to Asia and Pacific. So I don't think that we are at this stage of bipolar war or new Cold War. Also on other countries that probably do not support sanctions. If we talk about financial sanctions and prohibition to have the sanctions of Russian public officials and oligarchs, when they are on the OFAC level, this is international level sanctions, and all countries are obliged to follow it. They don't have to establish their own sanction regime. They have to follow OFAC sanctions, otherwise they will have issues with that. On the Dubai, I would say that the latest information from March from the plenary session is that Dubai is included in the list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring, so-called gray list. In the black list, we have only North Korea and Iran, where we don't expect to have any other countries. So when we are talking about FATF sanctions, it's mostly about a gray list, and United Arab Emirates are already there. What they have to do and how should they go further to be delisted from FATF, there is also a clear plan that includes to close loopholes enabling circumventing of sanctions. It includes increasing number of investigation of money laundering and terrorist financing. It includes improving resources for financial intelligence unit in the country, and improving mutual legal assistance with other countries that Dubai is currently not dealing well, and also with improving the number of suspicious activity reports. So yes, it is a place as known, well known for Russian oligarchs to keep their money, but it will be now more complicated for United Arab Emirates to keep their position, and they will need to move forward and to deal with the requirements from FATF further to be delisted from the gray list when they are currently already there.
Looks like we've lost Samantha once again. I'll take over. Who else would like to comment on this question before we have one last question? Anybody else? If not, I'll go for it myself. Tim?
We can only...
Yes, Valeria, please.
Yes, we can only add to Dubai some other circumventions practices. Christine Lagarde recently mentioned about cryptocurrencies. That's why we need, of course, to introduce immediately some action against cryptocurrencies. It's some addition to Dubai.
Just, I'll take over. Sorry, ladies and gents. I'm just going to, as I have been following, but I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and just ask the last question myself in that case, which is really maybe where do we go from here? You did talk a little bit about what was left to be done right at the very outset. I think Tim in particular, well, actually most of you. So assuming we're in for a war of attrition, what is the way of doing this? Do you ramp up the sanctions with each particular atrocity? Can you ramp them up incrementally day by day almost, or week by week for every week that Russia continues to be an invading power? Do you do it, or do you telegraph it that it will be ramped up every month, every couple of months? What's the best way in terms of not so much sequencing, but timing of continuing to increase this pressure? I assume you don't continue at the level where they are, because then Russia begins to get used to it, begins to learn to live with it, even at this high level. So what I'm asking for is, what's the best way in terms of the timing of a ramping up? I'm going to assume you agree. We all agree with a ramping up, but how does one do that step by step as we're in this for a long term? Let's go in the order we came in and start with Tim.
Yeah, actually, just pulling back a bit to the Dubai story as well and linking it to your question, James. I mean, I think one of the big takeouts from this crisis has been, the Americans or NATO and Ukraine have won the information war, right? So the information battle around sanctions is also really important. And I think with respect to jurisdictions like Dubai and Turkey, OFAC and Western sanctions agencies need to be all over these countries. They need to be telling them that, these are the rules. If we find you are doing stuff to undermine sanctions, we're going to be all over you. You will be FATF grey or blacklisted or whatever, right? And I think the messaging around sanctions is really, really important. And to be out there telling the Russians, telling the market what's coming next. If you go back, you go back to pre-invasion. Biden was crystal clear, right? He said that, the sanctions from hell were coming. We all tended to kind of think that wasn't going to be the case, because I guess the experience of sanctions since 2014 has been a bit disappointing, right? So getting out there, telling the market what's likely to come. As I mentioned, the May 25th general license for external debt payments is a real leverage point in my mind for Russia. I think that the Ministry of Finance blinked on the default scenario. They showed they hadn't got the balls to go through with it. They're worried about the long-term impact of a default scenario for Russia. Remember, people compare this crisis with 98, right? I'm sure we're all in 98, right? In the Russia crisis. For me, it's worse. And a default now for Russia would be much worse, because in 98, Russia, had the engagement of the international community to get them out of default, right? There was an IMF program. We all worked together to bring Russia out of default, and then they were kind of investment grade 5 years later. If they go into default this time, no one's going to be helping them come out of default, right? They are going to be in financial market isolation for a decade, right? So OFAC need to be telling the Russians that get out of Ukraine, or else we will force you into default, and you are going to be international pariahs for a decade in terms of financial markets. Because no one, in fact, interestingly, when Russia goes into default, okay, it's already lost its credit ratings, but even the Chinese, will not be lending into Russia when Russia is in default. And even if they do lend, they will be lending at astronomical interest rates for a long, long time to come. So again, we have this leverage. We just need to be clever in using it. And I think the Biden administration has done a good job in terms of how they've played this info war around sanctions.
That's fine. Thank you, Tim. Do you want to just anything on sort of sequencing, or not? Something. Sorry, it wasn't sequencing. It was how you do it in if we're in for a war of attrition. How you do it? How you pay it forward? How do you keep on going? What are the limits, or what are the timelines?
Sorry, is that for me or?
Yes, that's for you, Tim. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think that needs to be done anyway, right? We have this again. We have this huge leverage. They need to get out, right? Bottom line, they need to get out. They're obviously, we're worried about weapons of mass destruction. Obviously chemical weapons, biological, nuclear. They're all trigger points for stuff, right? Whether that's a sanctions response or it's a as the Russians like, a military kinetic response. I don't know, but okay. Yeah,
Katerina, do you want to say anything about how you play it forward? How do you keep going?
Yeah, I think that what we have to do is first to close already existing delays with implementation of certain measures in sanctions regime. And second, we have to establish a kind of management of this sanction regime. Either it's on the level of EU and then going down to the level of every EU member state. We have to think about how to manage this before and at the same time bring in new measures. I don't know about timing. Timing is like every day you are reading news and number of victims of war. So I think timing is like weeks, days. We don't know. So it's difficult for me to speak about timing.
Thank you, Katerina. Valeria, last words from you in terms of how you pay it forward.
Of course, we should not tell about days and weeks. We should understand that isolation and Russia should be isolated, and it should be pariah country until Putin regime is there. Let's imagine one day that Putin withdraw army tomorrow, and you know why? Because it's a failure everywhere in front. It's a shame. It's not an army. But in the same time, they even not occupy any one big city after 1 month. They just destroy real, infrastructure, industries, about all of that. let's assume that we stop at him tomorrow and he will be sitting in his bunker. You know, we have no chance for any local Russian coup within the Russia. We discuss it right now. And this person with red button will be sitting all the time on our neck. And that's why we need to isolate him right now totally and stop this isolation in one day when Putin regime will be not there anymore, not Russia, but Putin regime.
Okay, that's quite clear. Vladimir, last words from you, please, in terms of how do we go forward with this? How do we go forward with sanctions? And I suppose there are related questions here. I mean, two big questions for now, but on what does this ultimately mean for Russia's future viability as a state as we know it?
Yeah, the blow to viability has been great, and I agree with Team once again. It's a very different situation than what we had in the 80s and in the 90s, because we were in trouble back then, but things were improving. Gorbachev and Yeltsin did reforms. Russia was opening up. Market economy was replacing the outdated Soviet one, and the Western powers looked very positively and welcomed actually what happened in Russia. That's totally reversed now. So with all the dire straits that we have, things are going backwards. We're really being cut off, isolated from global systems on unprecedented scale. So there's no bright future for Russia. I mean, let's clearly formulate the end goal here. The end goal here is to get rid of Putin's regime. I agree with Valeria that it's not just an issue of stopping the aggression against Ukraine. Once Putin is in power, once this regime endures, it means that the risk of repeating similar events is extremely high. So I think right now it's a very good opening for us to move towards achieving the real end goal, changing the regime. That is possible because the structural damage that was done already is immense. And I have to say that we need not to simplify the situation. We keep searching for this like one magic silver bullet. A couple of weeks ago, it was SWIFT. Now it seems to be oil embargo, the game changer, right? We need to understand that we need to pull pressure on all fronts. Ukrainian military resistance, Western sanctions, changing Russian public opinion. All these issues should altogether change the equation and turn the situation around for Putin. That is possible. Again, I understand that Ukrainians want somebody to come and quickly overthrow him in a military coup. But listen, this is just not going to happen. Let's not be naive about that. Let's do all we can on all three fronts, bearing in mind that the problem is just not with the war. The war is essentially a consequence of Putin's regime, of which we have been warning people in the West for over 20 years now. So I think we should understand the end goal. We should aim at regime change. And with the structural damage that regime is suffering now, that seems to be far more possible than ever before. So we need to double down. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. That's exactly how I was going to end myself, by saying that horrific price as this is, with Ukrainian blood and frankly the potential destruction of Ukraine, then there is a possibility for a better Russia to come out of this. I'm not suggesting, I don't think you and I believe that whatever comes after Putin will necessarily be better than Putin, but at the same time, that shouldn't inhibit us from what we have always shied away from, is this question of regime change. It was Iraq that ruined that word for us, perhaps, but we need to probably be getting into it a little bit more, bearing in mind he is so obviously personally responsible, although there is a systemic problem with Russia as well, naturally. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just popping in at the end here. I don't know if Sam's mic is back or not, but just to say on behalf of...
I'm back.
That's Sam. Let me just say thank you for struggling through your internet problems, but most of all, of course, to our four speakers. Clearly, what we've been speaking about, we'll have to revisit frequently. If Russia is being sanctioned back to the Stone Age, then there are massive implications, not for Russia, yes, and we need to discuss that, for Ukraine and how this goes for Ukraine and globally as well. So we'll continue to cover this, as we must look at the future of Russia in this context as well. So my enormous thanks to the Chatham House team, to the four speakers, to Sam, and we will reconvene on this exact topic very shortly. My thanks. Sorry for keeping you away. Bye.